So we're gonna flip now to the quote unquote negative traits, which are the red ones. These are largely the ones that you want to pick in order to compensate for having way too many trait points used up with your positive traits. Say for some crazy reason you picked venerable and you picked extremely adaptive. So now you're sitting at -6 trait points, and you need to pick 3 traits in order to reverse that. So we're going to go over that now. We're actually going to go over them from best to worst again. And the best one is Deviance, because its governing ethics attraction is -15%. This is way handier for the mid and late game, in particular when you are in fact trying to change your governing ethics for example, with the situation I presented earlier, you're trying to change from your fanatic materialist because you don't need to worry so much about research, and you want to be fanatic or lean more towards militarist to get that fire rate bonus. Well, this trait of Deviance will actually help with that because it reduces governing ethics attraction by 15%. It only gives you back 1 trait point, but it's not a bad pick when you're trying to compensate for something that should probably be your go-to pick if you just need to get 1 trait point back. Non-adaptive. This is kind of my go-to pick for when I am creating my empires. The Zaxoid Collective, the Sutherian Stellar Coalition, even the Ilgiali Cult, which is another one that you guys haven't seen yet, but I might boot up a game with near the end of the stream. Non-adaptive gives you back 2 trait points, and I believe it's the only red one that does that. We'll just do another check here. Yes, it is. So right now it's the only red pick with a negative impact on your traits that gives you back 2 trait points. Why do I like this one so much? Well, number one, it gives you back 2 trait points. So just putting on here, now I still have 4 trait picks and I have 4 trait points. So I could essentially pick 4 green ones that only cost 1 point if I wanted to, just because I also have non-adaptive. Also, the not the bonus, the detriment that it causes, which is -10% habitability, it doesn't really have any effect at any point in the game aside from the very, very early stages. Because as I said, in society research, at a certain point you start picking up on different things that just increase the overall habitability of your native species or your empire. And there is even a repeatable tech for in the late game, which you can research over and over and over, which gives you 5% bonus habitability in the late game. So this is easily nullified probably by about the mid game, especially once you're about 100 years in and you've got a lot of research projects that you've been going through and you're steaming through more. It's very likely that you have completely overcompensated for this negative pick because of all the research picks, all the research projects that you've done to increase your habitability. So that's why I like it, and that's why I feel it's actually one of the better red traits or negative traits, supposedly, to pick, because it's a really good pick to compensate for how many positive ones that you've chosen. And as I said earlier, when you pick this, you can pick up to 4 positive ones. So we could go, say, rapid breeders. We could go, what's another good one? We could go enduring, and we could also go natural engineers, and one more, conservationist. You got 4 things that give you a whole bunch of different little bonuses here and there across the board, and it's all because you simply just picked non-adaptive, which isn't an entirely terrible pick to go with when creating your empire. Slow learners reduces leader experience gain by 25%. This I would pick Deviance or non-adaptive over this any day of the week, but this isn't a huge loss, because at certain points in the mid and the late game, you're recruiting new scientists that already are, say, levels, 3 or 4 sometimes, and they're still getting their experience. This would largely only affect the earlier game, just like earlier when I mentioned with quick learners, it'll probably only increase the maximum level that your very early game scientists get before they die by 1. This will probably reduce it by 1, which it can be quite detrimental early game, but as the game carries on and on and on, and you get more research projects done where your leaders start to live longer, and you can recruit new ones for less influence and stuff like that. Then slow learners pretty much has no negative effect on it. So it's one of those things where it's like early on it can kind of be a little bit frustrating to go with, but it becomes less of an obstacle as the game goes on. So it's not a terrible negative pick to go with. What's another one? Repugnant. Reduced ruler opinion impact. This is another one where it's like the opposite of charismatic. It's like, if you pick this, big deal. So it's an okay one to go with if you're trying to compensate. Like if you've gone totally crazy and picked, for example, venerable and very strong or something, and you're just trying to tack on some negative trait points, repugnant doesn't have that bad of a negative effect with reduced ruler opinion impact, so it's not a bad one to pick. Decadent, happiness without slaves. This species requires slaves or servants to feel content. This one is overall kind of a bad pick in my opinion, because having decent happiness is good, because overall happiness directly correlates with overall productivity. However, it can combine decently well if you intend on creating an empire that has slaves. So it's easily compensated for by simply having an empire with a caste system. So you have, so say you have something like an imperial authority, for example, and when you get into the game, your how do I word this? Your species rights, your civilian rights, and whatnot. You go by a caste system, at which point any pops that are on, I believe, mining networks and power plants. At the very least, I know it's mining networks. Any pops that are on mining networks are automatically slaves. So any pop that is on there that is a slave, well, there you go. You're compensating for this loss of happiness without slaves just by putting a pop on a mining network, which is handy. So let's continue that further. It can actually be beneficial because, say you have other picks like industrious and very strong, and you have a species pick kind of like this, where you have not just decadent but also non-adaptive to compensate for industrious and very strong, where your native species garners 25% additional mineral generation. Well, all of your pops that are on a mining network are slaves. So you're not losing happiness by putting them on there. In fact, they are being more productive, they're being quite productive because they generate more minerals than anything else by being on there. You've also got mining guilds that you've picked, and there was one other thing. I'm trying to find it. It might be an ethic. Oh, here we go. Slaver guilds is some degree of authoritarian. So if you are an authoritarian, if you have an authoritarian ethic, for example, this will reduce your slave unrest, and you can pick. Is it still there? Slaver guilds. There you go. So okay, so it's hydroponics farms and mining networks, because slaver guilds increases food and mineral output of your slaves by 10% each. So combine that with your mining guild civic. So this means your 2 civics have it so that your slaves are producing 20% more minerals throughout your entire empire. And you go back to your traits, you have your slaves also producing 25% additional minerals because of your industrious and very strong species traits. This completely compensates for this Decadent pick. So Decadent is actually a great negative pick if you are role-playing and going with an authoritarian empire that has slaves and will use slaves and whatnot. I mean, it's a great pick to compensate for your other positive boons, because this is largely nullified, and you don't necessarily lose this. You don't necessarily suffer this happiness penalty. So it's very easily countered, and you can actually turn it into something completely beneficial if you did, something like the setup that I just showed you, for example. So Decadent, not a terribly bad trait to go with unless you're when you get in the game, unless you pick it where your empire does not have a caste system, in which case that would be bad, because you actually have reduced happiness, which is reduced productivity across the board there. Wasteful, increased consumer goods cost. This one isn't too bad of a pick, but I mean, you've got Deviance, which is actually a positive red pick over it. So there's definitely ones to go over it. This just increases consumer goods costs. So for every pop you have, they require, I believe it's more food and minerals in order to survive. So I would pick several other things over this, because this can actually, if you have a huge empire, this could actually have a pretty severe impact in your productivity in certain things. Let's go back up to the top here. What do we got? We did slow learners already. Weak. This reduces your army damage and mineral output. I kind of pile this along with the one that we just looked at, which is Wasteful. I wouldn't necessarily pick this almost ever, because the reduced mineral output, never mind the reduced army damage, that's not as huge of a deal, because especially if you're in a war and you're invading other people, you'll always win if you have more armies. Simple as that. But when you're invading their planets, but the mineral generation being reduced by 5%, it's not a huge loss, and it's compensated again with more technologies down the road. There is even a repeatable tech in the late game where every time you research it, it increases your mineral generation by 5% throughout your whole empire. So weak is an okay one to go with if you are trying to simply get back some trait points. I still think that something like Deviance would be a way better pick. So it's one of those, if you just need something to get a point back. I already did Repugnant. Okay, so let's get to some ones. This one, Fleeting, leader lifespan minus 10 years. Practically never want to pick this, because on the opposite end of enduring, allowing your leaders to live longer so that you don't have to spend a bunch of influence in order to recruit new ones, and not obviously Fleeting would be the exact opposite. Your leaders will start dying off pretty early in the game, and that could be a nightmare, because you just don't have enough influence to replace them all, and you wind up getting totally screwed on your research projects because you had too many scientists and whatnot die off at the same time, and you don't have enough influence to replace them. So it can screw you over. Fleeting is just not a really good one to go with. It's one of those, never pick this if you're trying to make a good empire. Go with it if you're trying to kind of role play some. Let's see. So what does that leave? Sedentary. Now, while I said that, me personally, I don't think Nomadic is a terribly good pick, but I did but you know, it does definitely have its uses. On the opposite end, Sedentary, I don't think this is a good one to go with because the negative impact that it has is just too much. Resettling pops is already very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? The cost can get reduced with certain research projects in the game, but it's still fairly costly in my opinion. And having that increased by 25% on your native species, I don't see any reason to go with it, as well as increasing the migration speed by, reducing the migration speed. I'm wording that wrong. Reducing migration speed by 50%. When you want your pops to move to those new colonies, so that those new colonies can build up and upgrade to the higher quality, more productive buildings as quickly as possible. Well, when those that are migrating are just taking, you know, 50% longer, and just making it take that much longer for those new colonies to get built up, Sedentary is not a good pick to go with to try and compensate for stuff. I would say never pick it. Solitary, overall happiness reduction, 5%. It's not a big loss. It's only a 5% reduction. So, you know, there are definitely bigger numbers out there to negatively impact things, but it's happiness, and less happiness overall means less production overall. So, Solitary is not a good pick. Like, on the flip side, where Communal is a pretty dang good one, Solitary is a very bad one to go with, in my opinion. So I don't think you should. I don't really think you should go with that. And then the number one red trait, I believe I've gone through all of them. We'll just make sure. The number one red trait that you definitely should never ever pick unless you are strictly role playing or just trying to do something for funsies. Slow breeders reduce growth speed by 15%. Just like rapid breeders is probably the best species trait you could pick, slow breeders is the worst one you could pick because it reduces your growth speed by 15%. Yes, you can change this out later on when you get the ability to gene modify and all that jazz, but the negative impact of this is so substantial, and even though it can be kind of overcompensated with your food production, it's still a pretty big hit, and you'll be feeling this until portions of the mid game, even when you can gene tailor this out. So I don't see a reason to ever pick the slow breeders trait. So that's largely a breakdown of the traits. Hopefully, I gave you guys a good idea of what you want to go with. As I said, some of the best ones: rapid breeders, natural engineers, agrarian, and intelligent. I would say that those are some of the best ones. And then you've also got some still pretty dang good ones like thrifty, industrious, natural physicists, natural sociologists. Adaptive's a pretty good one too. What was another one? Communal is quite good as well. And yeah, that about sums it up. I would say those are the most useful ones for green picks. And then for red picks, Deviance is actually a useful pick, even though it's played as a negative trait. It's actually a useful one, so it can give you back that much needed trait point if necessary. And non-adaptive is it gives you back 2 trait points, allowing you to pick to select more green options. And the loss in habitability is so easily overcompensated for, less than 100 years into the game, even like between about the early and mid game, or like the middle portions of the mid game, even you've pretty much compensated for this by certain research projects in society that increase your habitability, and you're probably getting to a point where you're actually overcompensating it because you're doing research projects that increase your habitability even further before getting to the repeatables. So non-adaptive is actually a pretty solid pick. It can slow things down a little bit for you early game, so you might want to hang back from colonizing super quick because Your pops will be less happy because of the lower habitability. So play a little more tall, and you really shouldn't have as many issues. Let's go ahead and look at